Hi, I'm Karen, and this is my Week 7 NFL picks. This has been some NFL season so far, so we're going to get right into the matchups. And I was 10-3 last week. So, the first game that we have that we're going to talk about is the Seattle Seahawks and the Cleveland Browns. Now, the Seattle Seahawks had a bye week last week, but in week 5, they won 36-25 over the Giants. Now, Jackson had 166 passing yards, and Whitehurst had 149 passing yards. They did have 10 penalties for 70 yards. They were sacked 6 times, and they made 3 interceptions. Now, that game did basically come down to a very crucial play where they got an interception off of a tipped ball from Victor Cruz, the Giants, and they played really well. They did have a strong team. It was a close game. Now the Cleveland Browns, they lost 17-24 to the Raiders. Now Colt McCoy had 215 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. They did have 5 penalties for 34 yards. He was sacked 2 times. Now the Browns are playing really well. They are a consistent team. They're playing in Cleveland. They're doing a good job. So when you have this matchup, I think I'm going to go with all the guys on Inside the NFL, and I'm going to pick the Cleveland Browns. Now the next matchup is the Atlanta Falcons and the Detroit Lions. Now the Atlanta Falcons won 31-17 over the Panthers. Ryan had 163 passing yards. They made 3 interceptions. They had 4 penalties for 57 yards. They had 1 field goal, 3 rushing touchdowns, 1 passing touchdowns. Now they are 3-3. They have gotten better as the season's gone along. They've come back. They had a slow start there. I think they're playing very well. But the Detroit Lions, they lost 19-25 to the San Francisco 49ers. The 49ers are doing great. Stafford had 293 passing yards, 1 interception. They had 6 penalties for 54 yards. He was sacked 5 times. Had a little coaching dispute at the end. I'm not going to talk about that. But I think the Lions, they are 5-1. They're playing very well. I think they're going to bounce back from this loss because it was a close game. And I think if you have me choose, the Detroit Lions are going to take that one. Now the next game, the Houston Texans and the Tennessee Titans. This one's can go either way. I think these two teams are pretty much evenly matched up. So this is a very hard choice. I mean, if you look at Inside the NFL, Phil Simms says the Houston Texans, Chris Collinsworth and Warren Sapp says the Tennessee Titans. It's a very hard decision. Let's see. If you look at the Houston Texans, they lost 14-29 to the Ravens. Schaub had 220 passing yards, 5 penalties for 15 yards. He was sacked 4 times. The Texans easily have won against weaker teams. They played against a strong team and they lost. But now the Tennessee Titans, they had a bye week last week. And before that, in week 5, they lost 17-38 to the Steelers. Hasselbeck had 262 passing yards. They had 9 penalties for 70 yards. He was sacked 3 times. And they didn't play as well as I thought they were going to play. I think both teams, are struggling a little bit. But I'm going to go with Phil Simms and pick the Houston Texans to win that matchup. Now the next matchup we're going to talk about, and this one's a little exciting matchup. It's going to be a very interesting one. The Denver Broncos and the Miami Dolphins. Now let's talk about the Denver Broncos. They had a bye week last week, but in week 5 they lost 24-29 to the Chargers. Now Kyle Orton had 34 passing yards and Tim Tebow had 79 passing yards. They had 4 penalties for 53 yards. No sacks, 1 touchdown interception return, 1 field goal. Tebow run had 1 touchdown run, 1 passing touchdown. They had 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter with Tim Tebow. And Tim Tebow is going to start for the Broncos. The fans are going to get their wish. So we're going to see how well he plays. I hope he does really well. I'd like to see him have a really good start. So you kind of, it doesn't matter who you are. You always, there's so many people against him. You really pull for him and hope he does really great as quarterback. You definitely see the team and the excitement and the energy really increased when Tim Tebow was put in that game. It was just a whole big difference that he made, and they almost beat the Chargers. They really almost won that game. Now, Miami Dolphins, they lost 6-24 to the Jets. Moore had 204 passing yards, 2 penalties for 10 yards, 2 interceptions, 4 sacks. They had 5 fumbles, but only lost 1. The Dolphins, they haven't won yet. They're playing very poorly. They're not doing well. Chad Henne, is out for the season. They're struggling quite a bit. I think the Broncos are going to win. Denver Broncos. Now the San Diego Chargers and the New York Jets. Now the San Diego Chargers had a bye week. In week 5, they won 29-24 over the Broncos. Rivers had 250 passing yards, no penalties. He was sacked 5 times. Chargers are doing good. Rivers is playing great. They had a strong start. They did almost lose against the Broncos, but they do have a very good team. Now the Jets won 24-6 over the Dolphins, but of course the Dolphins are a weaker team. They are struggling this season. Sanchez had 201 passing yards. They had 6 penalties for 49 yards, 2 sacks. They are getting more to the running game again. They are trying to fix the problems that they had. I still don't think the Jets, though, are going to pull it together. And I'm going with the Chargers. Now, the next matchup that we're going to talk about here is the Chicago Bears and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, the Chicago Bears, they won 39-10 over the Vikings. Cutler had 267 passing yards, 3 penalties for 15 yards. He was sacked 1 time. The Bears look really strong. They're getting things together. They had a great showing. I was, really liked what I saw. Now, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had a surprising win, 26-20 over the Saints. Freeman had 303 passing yards, no sacks, 7 penalties for 64 yards, and they made 3 interceptions. Great comeback after their embarrassing loss to the 49ers. The Buccaneers, they're still, I think that was just, they had a really good week. I don't think they're going to be strong enough to beat the Bears, and I'm going to go with the Chicago Bears. Now, the Washington Redskins and the Carolina Panthers. The Washington Redskins lost 13-20 to the Eagles. Now, Grossman had 143 passing yards, 4 interceptions. Sacked 2 times, 2 sacks in the game. Now, because of the 4 interceptions, Beck was brought in. He had 117 passing yards. They did make 2 interceptions, 9 penalties for 75 yards. Grossman did lose his starting spot, and Beck is now going to be the starting quarterback. They have a lot of problems. They really just lost it there. Now, the Carolina Panthers, they did lose 17-31 to the Falcons. Cam Newton had 237 passing yards. He had 2 rushing touchdowns. They had 7 penalties for 85 yards, and he was intercepted 3 times, though. But I think the Carolina Panthers, they are playing steady. They are doing well. They are due another win, though, and I think they're going to have enough to beat the Redskins. I'm going with the Carolina Panthers. And so does Chris Collinsworth. He picks the Carolina Panthers, too. Now, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Arizona Cardinals. Now, the Pittsburgh Steelers won 17-13 over the Jaguars. Ben Roethlisberger had 200 passing yards. They did have 8 penalties for 65 yards. The Steelers are it's like every other week they have a really amazing week. They're playing very well. They're a strong team. They're doing, they're really getting back on track. They have a lot of talent on that team. I know they said Troy Polamalu had concussion-like symptoms, but they are playing very well. Now, the Arizona Cardinals, they had a bye week, but in week 5 they lost 10-34 to the Vikings. Kolb had 232 passing yards. He had 6 penalties for 64 yards. He was sacked 4 times. No interceptions. They had 1 touchdown and 1 field goal. They just couldn't score points. They just were playing very horrible. So you put them against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and definitely the Steelers are going to take that game. Now the Kansas City Chiefs and the Oakland Raiders. Now the Kansas City Chiefs had a bye week. In week 5, they won 28-24 over the Colts. Now Matt Castle had 257 passing yards. They had 5 penalties for 39 yards, sacked 2 times. They did have 4 touchdown passes. Now that was a close game with the Colts. They were losing for most of the game, but they did rally back and beat the Colts. Now the Oakland Raiders, they won 24-17 over the Browns. Now Bowler had 100 passing yards. Jason Campbell, he is out for the season. He had 52 passing yards, and then he has a broken collarbone, so he is out for the season. They did sign Carson Palmer, but Bowler will be the starting quarterback. They had 5 penalties for 35 yards. Of course, they did get sacked 2 times, and even though Bowler will be the starting quarterback, I do think the Raiders are going to be able to win that game. Now the Green Bay Packers and the Minnesota Vikings. Now the Green Bay Packers, they won 24-3 over the Rams. Rodgers had 310 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. They only had 3 penalties for 16 yards. Sacked 1 time, only had 1 interception. The Green Bay Packers are the only undefeated team. They're doing amazing. They're the strongest team. They're unbelievable. The Minnesota Vikings, they lost 10-39 to the Bears. McNabb had 177 passing yards, and then Christian Ponder was put in the game. They were sacked 5 times, 5 penalties for 40 yards. I haven't heard yet who's starting the game, who's going to be the starter for this game, but they just had enough with McNabb. Christian Ponder was put in, and they just couldn't get anything together. So definitely the Vikings against the Packers. Green Bay Packers are going to stay undefeated. There's no question in my mind about that one. Now the St. Louis Rams and the Dallas Cowboys. Now the St. Louis Rams, they lost 3-24 to the Packers, and actually that's what they were favored. The Packers were favored, 24-point lead. Bradford had 321 passing yards. They had 7 penalties for 45 yards. Sacked 3 times, had 1 interception. The Rams are just struggling. Bradford's doing well. He just doesn't have the talent around him to really accent his talent. Now the Dallas Cowboys lost 16-20 to the Patriots. The Patriots rallied at the end of the game to win that game. Tony Romo had 317 passing yards, 10 penalties for 77 yards. They made 2 interceptions. Tony Romo was intercepted 1 time. They had 1 fumble, and they did lose at the end of the game. They were winning towards the end, but as I said, Brady came back the last drive and won that game. People are questioning whether Tony Romo has enough talent to take the Cowboys to the Super Bowl. But I'll tell you, you put the Cowboys against the Rams, the Cowboys are going to get a win. Now the Indianapolis Colts and the New Orleans Saints. The Indianapolis Colts lost 17-27 to the Bengals. Painter had 188 passing yards. They had 2 penalties for 11 yards, 1 sack, 1 interception, 2 fumbles. And the one that lost them the game is Pierre Garçon tried to do a lateral to try to save at the end of the game and wound up fumbling the ball. It came right down to the end. They could have scored 1 time and got ahead but instead they had that fumble and it was ran in for a touchdown and they lost. But they get closer and closer each game to winning, so hopefully one of these games here very soon they will have a win here. They're getting very close. Now, the New Orleans Saints lost 20-26 to the Buccaneers. Drew Brees had 383 passing yards. He was intercepted 3 times. There were 7 penalties for 53 yards, no sacks. Now, the New Orleans Saints are still a great team, a force to be reckoned with. I will tell you, though, that the Saints will probably win this game. They should win this game. They're more likely going to win this game. But I hope the Colts do an upset on this game. I mean, Drew Brees always loses a game to interceptions, and I think this is the game that he lost it to. There's always one game a season. And, you know, they had a bad game last week and lost to the Bucs, so I hope the Colts can pull a win through in Peyton Manning's hometown. I hope they do it. The Saints will probably win, though. And last game, Baltimore Ravens and the Jacksonville Jaguars. Baltimore Ravens won 29-14 over the Texans. Flacco had 305 passing yards. He was intercepted 1 time, sacked 2 times. They had 5 penalties for 25 yards and 1 fumble. The Ravens are a strong team. They're doing very well. You know, even though Chris Collinsworth and Phil Simms thinks the 1-5 Jaguars are going to win, I'm sticking with Warren Sapp and the Ravens. But Jacksonville Jaguars lost 13-17 to the Steelers. Gabbert had 109 passing yards. They had 4 penalties for 22 yards. They're struggling. They're not doing very well. They're 1-5. They're not, they can't, really make the big plays. Gabbert's still a young quarterback. This is his first season. You put these 2 teams against each other, I think it's going to be the Ravens. And, the way I look at it, though, is if Chris and Phil can pick the 1-5 Jaguars to beat the Baltimore Ravens, who are 4-1, then why can't the Colts beat the Saints? But, so to recap who I pick the Browns over the Seahawks, the Lions over the Falcons, the Texans over the Titans, the Broncos over the Dolphins, the Chargers over the Jets, the Bears over the Buccaneers, the Panthers over the Redskins, the Steelers over the Cardinals, the Raiders over the Chiefs, the Packers over the Vikings, the Cowboys over the Rams. The Saints will probably beat the Colts, but I hope the Colts do an upset. The Ravens over the Jaguars, and it's a bye week for the Bills, the Bengals, the Patriots, the Giants, the Eagles, and the 49ers. So those are my Week 7 picks. Enjoy your football this weekend, and see you next week.